God has been with me all my life. He's been so good to me, But I just feel like he's not hearing our prayers. I just feel like he's turned his back on me. I could never have told you that morning that exactly 1 week later, we would be sitting in that doctor's office and she would be getting the help.
She didn't have strength in her legs yet, but she slid off the couch and started crawling around the floor and laughing.
Really that the benefit of a relationship with God is not that your life's going to be perfect or that there's never going to be difficulties in your life, but it's the fact that God is present in those difficulties with you in a saving way.
The Faith on Fire podcast. Faith in Jesus like you've never heard before. And here's your host, Oriel O'Gorman.
Welcome to the show. In episode 20, we continue Sarah's story, which we started last week, about all that she went through. And this week, as I said, is really the good part. How an awful and hopeless situation turned around very rapidly and unexpectedly. So this is episode 20, Sarah's story, part 2. So we really had hit rock bottom and we felt like God was not there. I remember being on the phone to my dad one Saturday, and my dad is a pastor. He's a man of faith himself and walks with God. And I remember saying to him, Dad, God has been with me all my life. He's been so good to me, But I just feel like he's not hearing our prayers. I just feel like he's turned his back on me, Almost was afraid to say it. But that's how we truly were feeling at this point, And I remember that Monday night that you had referred to in Eddie Rockets, and went home that night. The next morning, the kids were to go to friends of ours that live in County Wicklow, and they were going to spend the day with them. And I remember that morning getting the kids up. I had to get them some breakfast, make sure that they had clothes for the day. God help our poor kids, me dressing them during those few months,
doing their hair, do you remember?
Doing that. Well, the hair I just didn't bother. Okay.
Don't tell me that.
No, the hair was like a bridge too far as I was concerned. Well, but I was doing my best, Yeah. But I remember I got them all out to school, and there's the bustle of the morning. And I think by and large, I felt sad, but I channeled it into trying to do something to solve the problem. I was looking for a doctor that could diagnose Sarah if she had Lyme disease or not, and then treat her. I was trying to keep things going. I was trying to solve as many problems as I could. And I remember that morning when they went out and our friends drove away with the 4 kids, just going back into the house, and just all the emotion that maybe I had stifled just welled up in me in a moment. And I remember just bursting into tears, and the tears rolled down my face, and I sobbed, and I said, God, this used to be a happy home. Everything is so dark right now. And it wasn't a prayer of great faith. Like, it was just a prayer of, I don't know what to do. Like, it doesn't seem like you're helping us, you're answering. And one of the most intense moments, I think, of my life. And I remember just kneeling down by the leather couch there and just saying, God, you have to help us somehow. And so I pulled myself together. I had to go into the hospital, I think, to relieve you so you could go and be with the kids and do the things you needed to do. And it took me, I just remember, it just took me a long time to get ready, But I finally, got myself together, got in the car. I'm driving in. Now, I had called, I would say, 30, 40 doctors around the world, left messages. And I'd called one doctor in Albany, New York. And I'd left a message. And honestly, you know what it's like in Ireland. Very often, if you don't get a hold of the person,
no one calls you back.
No one calls you back, Yeah. So I'm thinking, he'll never call me back, But lo and behold, I'm on the way in, and bear in mind, I had just cried out to the Lord. And I'm driving into the hospital, and I get a phone call from a US number. Now, not totally unusual. I work with people in the United States.
Yeah.
And so I would get calls from the US every once in a while. But on the phone was the wife of the doctor in Albany, New York. And of course, I just described to her, in a pretty raw manner where Sarah was at. I said, she's this sick. We're trying to get help from a doctor here that might be able to treat her, but it's become such a bad situation. The doctors have said there's no way she has Lyme. That doctor couldn't get into the hospital to see her if he wanted to now at this point. And so I just described, she's so sick, like she can't move. Her joints are hurting her. And the more I described to her, I think being a people that were very familiar with Lyme, and this particular practice in America has treated literally thousands of people with Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses. And the more I explained, she said she may well have Lyme disease, some of the symptoms you're describing. And so she said, look, the best thing to do might be to do like a Skype consultation with the doctor, with my husband. And I just described, like, she's so sick. I mean, I don't know. And this was going to be weeks away, even just to Skype the doctor. And we didn't know what was going to happen in the hospital. And so I don't know. I can't even remember all that was said. But she finally said to me, she said, well, look, my husband doesn't see patients on a Tuesday. But if you can get her over here, he will see her next Tuesday. Now, this physician, in my opinion, is the best doctor. He was definitely the best doctor for Sarah, if not the best doctor to treat Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses in the world. Unbelievable. And very much in demand. And yet she took pity on us and she said, if you can get her over here. Now, that seemed like a long shot, Yeah. So I remember going into the hospital that night, and the struggle I had was, what if it's not Lyme?
Yeah.
What if we go all the way over there and it's for nothing? That's actually not what's wrong with her, and this doctor isn't able to help her, And so I just remember praying. I remember you were calling me like every half hour. Have you decided yet? Have you decided yet? Have you decided? But I just didn't, although it seemed like a door was opening, I didn't want to put a step wrong, know. And I remember this was so simple, but the Lord reminded me of the story of Moses when he was born, and his mother Jochebed, the Bible says that, she saw that he was a proper child, and I think she knew that he was destined for some great purpose. So she put him in a little basket and put him in the River Nile in this little basket.
Because the babies were in danger.
Yes, of course.
The Pharaoh had said that they had to kill all the baby boys. But she had seen that he was a proper child and was willing to do something.
And what blew me away was she took a risk to save her life from that law of Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And I thought, I need to take a risk to try to save little Sarah's life, because who knows what God is going to use her for, what journey she'll have with God, what God will do with her little life, And I remember, phone calls, the mission agency that we work with, phone calls in late at night, talking to my boss there, my higher up there at the mission agency. And it was incredible. I'm just briefly kind of outline, because I know we're pressed for time, but he said, look, all of the flights will be taken care of. Now, we were going to have to book like business class seats for little Sarah because she couldn't sit up
at
all. She would have to lie down. And then another fella called that you had taught in church as a kid. He was a kid, and he was in your Sunday school class, right?
Yeah, he was 8 when I taught him. And here he was grown up, and he was at that point living near the airport that we were going to be landing in.
Yeah.
And so he made phone calls, and not that involved us at all. He just made phone calls to different people to set up transportation for us, and a big a kind of minibus type 15-passenger van to come collect us from the airport.
Which we needed because
For the
she was so,
wheelchair.
the wheelchair and all the luggage. But also, Sarah had to lie down, so she could lie down in the bench seats in that. I remember that particularly, I think, touched Sarah's heart.
Yeah.
That, like, God had provided a van that she could lie down in, you know. And then, will you tell
By
the story
Wednesday-
about your family, the apartment?
Yeah, and so by Wednesday, we were making plans to go then at that point. So we called my parents in the States and just said, look, a doctor in Albany, New York is able to see Sarah next Tuesday. So the flights we're booking the flights. The cost is covered. And my mom said, what are you going to do in Albany? We don't know anyone. I had never been to Albany before. It's a few hours away from New York City. We didn't know anyone. We didn't know what it was like. We didn't know it was available there. Nothing. No history with that town at all. And my mom went back. She hung up the phone from me and went back to what she was doing, which just happened to be that she was at dinner with my dad with college friends of ours who they hadn't seen in a while. We definitely had not seen in years.
Yeah.
Who normally would be living 20-something hours away from my parents, but they just happened to be in the town where my mom and dad live, and happened to be at dinner with my parents when we called. And the wife there of the couple said, well, I have a friend who has a brother that lives in Albany and goes to a church there, and they have an apartment at the church for people to stay in sometimes. And so they made phone calls, again, not connected to us. They made phone calls. Yeah. And so within such a few short days, so literally from Wednesday when we decided for sure to go, to before Friday morning, everything was in place. We had a wheelchair from a nurse friend here in Ireland. We had a neck support for Sarah that your sister got. We had the nurse to take us from the hospital straight to the airport. Everything was in place by Friday morning, and we're going to leave Sunday morning.
And it just, and the story of how we got to America is another story in itself. But basically, we were able to discharge her from the hospital. The doctors weren't happy, but we were confident that we were taking her to competent care and that she was going to get the care she needed. And
a lot of checks had been done that there was no issues with pressure in her brain or in her spine, or so we'd been very careful that way too, that she was okay to fly.
And in fairness to the doctors, they did have to check a lot of things to make sure that there wasn't something glaring physically wrong with her that they could detect before they concluded, look, as far as we can tell, it's psychiatric.
Yeah.
And but she felt a little bit better that day. We got her onto the plane. We got across the ocean. The family picked us up in New York
on an Easter Sunday.
On an Easter Sunday,
Spent their Easter Sunday.
Yeah. And took us up to Albany. God bless them, And we arrived at the apartment, and it was all wheelchair accessible. There was a little wheelchair lift. Of course, Sarah could barely go in a wheelchair at this point.
We had to hold her into the wheelchair, and put our arm around her and hold her in.
Yeah. And that Tuesday, we were in the doctor in Albany's office. And after reviewing her symptoms, he got us to fill out a long questionnaire. He reviewed her symptoms, and he said, based on her symptoms, we're going to do blood work to confirm, but he said, I would be confident that she has Lyme and probably other co-infections, which she did end up having. She had also anaplasmosis, and she had babesia, which are other tick-borne illnesses from the same tick bite, but multiple infections. And he started treatment right away. Gave her IV antibiotics and other natural treatments that really helped her. Of course, we're sitting here beside our trusty home oxygen
Hyperbaric
chamber,
oxygen
our
chamber.
hyperbaric oxygen chamber, which of course has been a great help to Sarah. And it was just amazing that a week after absolute rock bottom crisis, all these pieces of the jigsaw had fallen together. And in the weeks ahead, the Lord provided all the money. It was just incredible. In our hometown, some of the people from the school and just people we'd known over the years in Arklow where we lived, got together, did a fundraiser, had a kids disco, did all sorts. I think there was a raffle, wasn't there?
Yeah. And a bake sale.
And a
And
bake
all
sale,
sorts.
yeah.
Yeah.
And raised money to help with her treatment. And like we could never have afforded it without that,
And then there were friends of friends that we'd never met that stepped in and helped as well. And churches across America and in Ireland. And
Yeah.
it was really remarkable how many. And I just remember particularly the one day that we got the text about the school families. Just getting the text and just sitting there crying, realizing, these are busy families.
Yeah.
That none of them would have anything to spare, but they're all joining together and they made such a huge difference.
Yeah.
And so many like that. We couldn't even start to name names or anything. There were so many people that
Yeah.
stepped in.
I remember just us crying, like,
Many times.
there was tears,
Yeah.
And just what hit me through the whole thing was that sometimes when you're at your darkest hour and you've cried out to God for help, it seems like he's not answering.
Yeah.
And that is a very lonely place to be, But I think of what it says in Psalm 18. David talks about in the first few verses how he cried out to God. God is my rock, and I cried to him. I asked him to deliver me, And then there's a long passage where it talks about, God coming on the clouds and he's, thundering and casting out lightnings. And then it comes to, I don't know which verse is in the chapter, but it comes to this verse where it says, God delivered me and he drew me out of many waters, And it struck me through that whole experience that sometimes when you cry out to God, you don't realize it, but help is on the way. God has already begun to put the wheels in motion to answer your prayer in your hour of need. But you don't see that, It's like the rescue helicopter. We lived in Arklow for years, and I remember we'd often see the rescue helicopter flying overhead. And, if a boat gets into difficulty out on the sea and they radio for help, the helicopter may leave the base, but the people on that boat that's sinking can't immediately see the helicopter. And finally, that helicopter comes over the curvature of the earth and they can see it on the horizon. But that helicopter left the base long before they could see it. And I think sometimes answered prayer is like that. And I really felt that. I remember that morning in the cabin. It was a Tuesday morning. God felt so far away. Like everything was going wrong. Sarah was so sick. We felt like we were getting no help from the doctors to fix that, what we believed was a physical problem. And it didn't seem like there was any hope in sight, And I could never have told you that morning that exactly 1 week later, we would be sitting in that doctor's office and she would be getting the help. And once she started getting the IV treatment, she rapidly improved, She got, you remember how...
She was able to start eating by the end of the week by herself.
Yeah, yeah. And you remember the day she first was able to crawl around, and she sat up.
It was maybe 6 weeks later, was it?
Yeah, yeah.
And she'd been moving her hands and she'd started moving her legs in the bed,
Yeah.
kind of wiggling them, but she didn't have control of her neck yet. So I remember praying that God would strengthen her neck, that the disease would continue to leave her body. And then that day, you laid her on the couch and you had to go work. So you're working upstairs. We'd set up a little office. And I was downstairs and she was so happy because she was getting better.
Yeah.
And you laid her on the couch, and the kids were all there around her, and they were talking and laughing and playing. And she just sat up. She had the strength to sit up. And then she's zany and funny and full of life. And she didn't have strength in her legs yet, but she slid off the couch and started crawling around the floor and laughing. And and I just remember the squeals coming from the kids. And I ran into the room from the kitchen and just remember kind of just leaning up against the wall, because it was like God gave them as a moment as siblings.
Yeah.
This beautiful moment to see her getting better.
Yeah.
And it's like I can see it in slow motion in my head. It's so beautiful. But the girls grabbed hands around her and were just jumping and squealing and laughing. And then our son just stood to the side and just cried and laughed and was so happy. And it was just those moments of moving forward then to see God bring joy back into their little lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just so beautiful. Mm-hmm. I remember by that point we'd rented a house in Albany, and I just remember the sunshine coming in the window. I remember you coming up and getting me from the office, and it's just amazing to see her turning around, getting better, you know.
And then after that, she'd crawl anywhere in the house and just pop up and surprise us. She couldn't walk yet, but she was crawling.
And it was just amazing over those two odd months that we were there, a little over 2 months that we were there in Albany, to see her improve. And, I always think I at that point had always envisioned that she would get better and then she would be good.
Yeah.
But it hasn't been that way, has it?
No.
It really hasn't been that way. And we're very thankful for that initial recovery. But
because by the time we came back home to Ireland, she was walking. Her legs were still not strong.
Yeah.
You could tell that she had gone through something, and she still had a bit of a limp in her gait.
Yeah.
But she was up on her feet, and she was bright and happy and full of life again, just back to her normal self.
Yeah.
And we came back to Ireland, and there was so much joy with her school friends and lots of family around, and they threw a little party for her and everything. It was just the most beautiful time, and we were so full of joy. But then, it hasn't gone in straight lines.
Then in September, she had a setback where she got somewhat sick again. She wasn't as bad as she'd been before, but she had to have antibiotics again. She was having difficulty walking, and she had to be home from school, didn't she? For a couple of weeks sometime, and then that spring again she had a much more serious relapse and apparently this is very common with Lyme patients, particularly if Lyme patients don't get treated with antibiotics early on. It comes back, and sometimes it comes back with a vengeance, And I remember her getting very sick in February of 2020, and just very difficult. She got so sick that she was back in a wheelchair. She was not able to move very much at all, and so we actually ended up bringing her again to Albany. And thankfully, antibiotics, hyperbaric treatment, some other natural things, just intravenous vitamin C, some simple proven things that helped her, a lot of natural supplements. But, and she did get well again and continue. But right now, even today, as we film this, she's having a relapse and has been. And she went back to school at the beginning of September. She was back for a week or two and began to feel weak. Loved being back at school.
So happy.
Loved it.
She would not slow down. Even though we were like, please be careful.
Running around top speed, a pee and a break, and saying, my legs are hurting. No wonder, But sadly, she's not well right now. She's missed, a couple of weeks of school, and she's sick again. And really, we've seen that, life often doesn't go in straight lines, like you said. And, I think the fact that she's had problems again doesn't diminish just the awesomeness, if that's even a word, of the initial recovery and how God stepped in, because she could have died. 1% of people with anaplasmosis indeed die. If it progresses, they get multi-organ failure. This is according to the CDC, and they actually die. That could have been Sarah,
And her doctor, I remember one of the early times that she had started walking, and her doctor came out of the office to see her with the physio walking up the hallway and back very slowly, but she was on her feet walking. And I remember him looking at us saying, if she hadn't come, I don't know if she would have. And he just kind of left it, but we all knew, and Sarah knew. And I remember her saying at one point, Daddy, I probably wouldn't be here if I hadn't gone there to get treatment.
Yeah. And I think it's true, and I think it saved her life,
Yeah.
and, she has had a lot of quality of life since. And I think God has taught her and us things through these relapses. She's in maybe the 6th time that she's had serious problems with the Lyme disease. And, we're hopeful that, and we're grateful that she can get treatment and that there has been helps for her. But what has been the takeaway for you with these relapses? First of all, did you find it a bit disappointing when she got sick again?
I did. And I remember particularly when she got sick it's not last anyway. It's in the spring of 2020.
Yeah.
Right before COVID hit. We had to come back in the middle of all the COVID, all the countries locking down. It was pretty scary.
Yeah. We nearly didn't get home.
To the other 4 kids. But I remember when we were thinking about and planning to go back to America, and she was asking questions like, I thought God made me better. Why is this happening? Why am I sick again? I thought he made me all better. And feeling a little bit panicked in my heart, like, Lord, I don't have an answer I don't know really what to say. Yeah. And I remember your dad coming down, and he has a really strong walk with God and deep faith. And I remember she asked him that a few days before she flew to America. And he just said, well, if it all worked out perfectly, we wouldn't really need to trust God, would we? Yeah. And he said, this isn't about just your life going great. This is about you knowing God and trusting God and developing a relationship with God. And that settled my heart so much. And when he said that and just putting puzzle pieces together, I guess, as we all grow in our journey of faith, and just remembering many years ago, it could have been when I was a teenager, I heard a story of a couple, and they really, really loved each other. They were so committed, everyone knew they loved each other. But then the wife got cancer.
Yeah.
And she was so sick during the treatment, and her immune system was so suppressed that her husband couldn't even go in the room with her anymore.
Yeah.
But he would sit outside the room every single day, all day long. And just all day he was there. And he couldn't even do anything to comfort her. He couldn't touch her. He couldn't hug her. He couldn't kiss her. Couldn't hold her. But he was just there. And I just remember thinking, that proved his love and commitment, his faithfulness to his wife, that care, more than in all the good days. And it just made me realize, as believing in God and trusting God and having a strong faith and walk with God, where we've spent time getting to know God, it doesn't mean that it's like magic that life is going to be perfect and everything has a happily ever after, and everything you snap our fingers and sprinkle the fairy dust and everything works out. It's just not like that.
Yeah.
And that there is still difficulty and there's still suffering, and we live in a broken world that's messed up, and it was created perfect at first.
Yeah.
And then we humans brought all kinds of problems and sin and destruction into the world, and it's just caused so much pain and suffering for all of us, for each other.
And it affects all of us,
It does. And it's not that Sarah got sick because she sinned or anything like that. It's just the state of this world, that we live in a broken world now.
Yeah.
But what has comforted me through all these relapses and just strengthening my faith is that in Isaiah, it says that it's talking about Jesus, and it says that he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And I often think that grief was his friend. It wasn't that Jesus was, everything was all, he was the Son of God. He walked this earth, and yet his life didn't go perfect. He suffered. And then in Hebrews 2, there's the most beautiful picture of why Jesus suffered. And I've often thought this, when we suffer, we're not on that road alone. Jesus literally walked that road of suffering before us. And Hebrews 2 says that that Jesus suffered and he was tempted like us. And then it gives the reason why. And it's very beautiful for me as a mother, and having gone through everything with Sarah, my child, that God actually decided to use a very intimate maternal picture at that moment to explain why Jesus suffered. Why couldn't God have just said, had some different plan, to forgive our sins and restore the relationship some other way? But it says that Jesus suffered so that he could, and it's an old-fashioned word, succor us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it literally has the idea of breastfeeding. And imagine that God would use that kind of an intimate word in his relationship with us in our suffering. But as a mother, it's like if you're holding a tiny baby who's distressed, there's nothing more caring and nourishing and close, and your arms are around the baby and you're caring for the baby, but that we can actually just be held by Jesus and be taking care of him that way.
Yeah.
And that
be taken care of by him
by
in that
Jesus
way.
And held and loved and protected as a mother would protect her child, and even nourished. Like, there's just so much in that inner suffering that he went down that road first so he could turn around and hold our hand and help us to walk through the suffering that is in our lives. And we can trust him. And I just feel like it's not been easy, but God has been there. He promised he would never leave us or forsake us, and he hasn't. And he's just, you turn around and look at the situation, and his hand is just, we keep saying it just so happened, and these things just kept happening, but it's not. God was divinely working all those little details out, and he was there the whole time, even when we felt like he wasn't.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
the
for
helicopter
us.
had left the base. He had a plan in motion.
Just couldn't see it yet. Couldn't see the red helicopter coming yet. And but we really can trust him.
Yeah. I think, just to sum up some of what you've shared, really that the benefit of a relationship with God is not that your life is going to be perfect or that there's never going to be difficulties in your life, but it's the fact that God is present in those difficulties with you in a saving way. And even if it's just to help us cope with difficult things that we can't change, it's so much better. I heard a man recently say he lost a child to illness at a young age. His daughter was just 5 years old. And he said, as difficult as that time was, he said, I realized that my worst day after I met Jesus was better than my best day before I'd met Jesus, because Jesus is present in my life. And I think we found that to be true through the whole thing with Sarah, is that the benefit of a relationship with him, and particularly through the relapses, over the last 2.5 years, is that God has been with us. And not only to help us to cope, but we've seen him answer prayer, and we've seen, I don't know how to term it, beneficial turns of circumstances, that there's just too many of them to say, it was just a coincidence. I think it's
It's
pretty
like that
clear.
verse, all things work together for
Yeah.
good to them
Yes.
that love the Lord. And it's like, it's not just that he makes us stronger, and it's beautiful that he is there with us, but he actually turns around and makes those hard things work out for our good.
Yes. And just to close with this thought that kind of a relation, we've talked about this kind of relationship with God. It's not reserved for certain people.
No.
And we're not by any means special or somehow deserving of that. I know that I am imperfect, that I'm a sinner, that I still miss it, and I don't deserve anything from God, Sometimes we get to think, I deserve all sorts of things. Well, the reality is, before God, we have done enough to make ourselves, because he's holy, to make ourselves, disapproved by him. He loves us, but he can't approve of our sin. And I just love that verse that Jesus said in the Gospel of John. He said, "He that comes to me, I will in no wise cast out." In other words, there's absolutely no way that if somebody who wants a relationship with God like that, there's no way that if someone like that comes to God, comes to Jesus, that Jesus will not do that for them. And there's more to it than that. And, if anybody that's listening is curious and we can help you by giving you some literature or, some help you to understand how to have a relationship with God, we will be more than glad to do that. But you can have that kind of relationship with God. It's not just for some people.
No.
It's for everybody. Jesus said there's no way that he will turn somebody who pursues that sort of relationship with God away. And so I think we'll leave it there for this week. But I want to thank you, Heather, for really just opening your heart and just sharing in a very real way, what the journey has been like. Well, thank you once again for listening. As always, you can get in touch with the show via email at info@faithonfireireland.net and check out the different formats, both in video on Facebook and YouTube and in audio only on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify, and turn on notifications so you get a little ding on your phone when a new episode drops. Well, thanks again for listening. Join us next time for episode 21, and we'll talk to you then.